All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're talking about Bitcoin, but maybe not the story you're used to hearing. As you can see from the title, Bitcoin's vile means, this is going to be a much more critical look at the world's most famous cryptocurrency. So to kick things off, we've got a quote from Shakespeare of all people. It's from Julius Caesar. Brutus, one of the guys who took down Caesar, is basically saying he's on the moral high ground. His noble goals can't be paid for dirty money. This really sets the stage for the entire conversation we're about to have. So, what on earth does a character from a 400-year-old play have to do with a digital currency from the 21st century? It's a fair question, right? Well, according to the sources for this explainer, the answer really frames this whole critique of how a technology that started with such high ideals might have completely lost its way. Okay, so before we get into the problems, we have to understand the dream. We need to go back to the very beginning and look at this utopian promise of a brand new kind of money. You know, Bitcoin didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was really born from the fire of the 2008 financial crisis. People's trust in banks and governments just evaporated. And right in the middle of all that chaos, this new idea comes along. A lot of the early adopters were influenced by things like the Ron Paul movement and Austrian economics, and they saw Bitcoin as this incredible, revolutionary chance to finally separate money from the state.
And you have to admit, the promise was it was powerful. It was sold as an escape hatch from central banks just printing money whenever they wanted. It had a fixed supply, just 21 million coins, which made people call it digital gold. The idea was that it would empower regular people against corrupt systems, giving them a way to hold assets that nobody, no government, no bank could control or just take away. For the early believers, this wasn't just a new gadget. It was a political revolution in the making.
But, you know, it didn't take long for that revolutionary promise to start showing some serious cracks. And the critique really begins by questioning one of the most sacred, fundamental ideas of the whole system. It's scarcity. Right. If you ask anybody who's into Bitcoin, they'll tell you the #1 rule. There will only ever be 21 million coins. That's it. It's not just a feature, it's treated like this sacred mathematical law of nature, something that can never be changed because it's written in the code itself.
But that leads to a really simple but kind of world-shattering question. If all the rules are just software, then who writes that software? Who actually controls the code?
Well, it turns out the answer is a shockingly small number of people. According to the sources, just 42 developers have written 90% of Bitcoin's code. And get this, only about 5 of them have the admin privileges, the real keys to the kingdom, so to speak. For a system that's supposed to be the definition of decentralized, well, that's not very decentralized, is it?
And look, this isn't some critic on the outside saying this. This is Vladimir van der Laan, the former lead maintainer of Bitcoin Core. When he resigned, he himself admitted that his own role was a centralized bottleneck. I mean, that is a huge admission from someone on the absolute inside, basically saying the quiet part out loud. True decentralization was more of an idea than a reality.
Okay, so this is where the story takes a really dramatic turn. This is where we get to the heart of the betrayal. The ideal of a free and open market allegedly broken not by a government, but by what one source calls a de facto money printer living right inside the crypto world itself. This all came to a head during a nasty, years-long fight they call the scaling war. It was all about a technical question. Should Bitcoin's block size get bigger so it can handle more transactions and be more useful as cash? On one side, you had the miners, the people actually running the network. On the other, that small group of core developers. Now, according to how Bitcoin was designed, the miners are supposed to be the ones who make the decisions. And their choice couldn't have been clearer. Support for bigger blocks was overwhelming. Over 90% of them were on board. So they should have won, right? But they lost. So how in the world did a tiny minority defeat a massive majority? The sources argue it all came down to market manipulation, powered by the stablecoin Tether. And here's how this flywheel allegedly worked. Step 1, print Tether tokens, maybe without the full US dollar backing you claim to have. Step 2, use those new tethers to buy up a bunch of Bitcoin. Step 3, that buying pressure artificially inflates Bitcoin's price. Step 4, Since your reserves are partly in Bitcoin, your reserves now look more valuable on paper. And step 5, you guessed it, you use that to justify printing even more Tether. It's like a perpetual motion machine for money. And if you're thinking that sounds kind of like a conspiracy theory, well, in 2021, the New York Attorney General's office dropped a bombshell after a long investigation. They said it flat out. Tether's claims that its virtual currency was fully backed by US dollars at all times was a lie. This was a massive confirmation that the market's explosive growth was fueled, at least partly, by pure deception.
Which brings us to the final, and maybe the most ironic, twist in this entire story. Bitcoin, the technology built to fight the state, to fight the elites, was ultimately co-opted and embraced by the very powers it was supposed to make obsolete. So here's the key concept you need to grasp. What our source calls a shadow central bank system. It's basically a system where these stablecoins, operating outside the normal rules, are used to do things that look a lot like shadow money printing and financing government debt. And who does that benefit? The government and corporate elites. And the scale of this is it's staggering. To back their tokens, stablecoin companies have to buy super safe assets. And what's safer than US government debt? By the middle of 2024, they were holding over $120 billion worth of. To put that number into perspective, that means stablecoin issuers now own more US debt than the entire country of Germany. Yeah, you heard that right. Germany, one of the biggest economies on the planet. In just a few short years, crypto went from fighting the system to becoming one of its most important bankers. So the result is this new, really strange alliance. You've got government administrations and politicians on both sides of the aisle embracing stablecoins as a way to finance US debt and keep the dollar on top. And the symbolism is it's wild. The same movement that started with idealists chanting "Bitcoin, not bombs" now has major crypto companies like Coinbase sponsoring military parades in Washington, D.C. The fusion is complete. And so we've come full circle, right back to that Shakespeare quote. The story of Bitcoin, at least as it's told by these sources, is one where a noble goal got corrupted by vile means. First through what they call market manipulation, and then by just getting absorbed into the very system it was built to fight. This table really just lays it all out. The myth of a fixed supply versus the reality of control by about 42 developers. The myth of decentralized mining versus the reality that just 6 mining pools control over 95% of all the blocks. The myth of a free market versus a market that was manipulated by a money printer. And the myth of empowering the little guy, when in reality, the wealth concentration is even more extreme than in the traditional US economy. And maybe no single person's story captures this whole tragedy better than Roger Ver. He was once called Bitcoin Jesus, a true idealist who put his money where his mouth was, funding anti-war sites with slogans like "Bitcoin, not bombs." And now, he's facing federal charges, basically hung out to dry by an industry that is now fused with the very government he spent his life trying to oppose. His personal story is like a perfect mirror for the ideological story of the whole project. And that leaves us with this final, really provocative question. If crypto failed to deliver on its promise, and if it's instead become just another tool for the powerful, then what is the real democratic alternative for people to actually reclaim control over their money? And that, is a question that goes far, far beyond code.